Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome to tonight's very exciting Free Library of Philadelphia Foundation author event. It is wonderful to see you all here. As I've often said, the author event series is one of this city's great cultural treasures. By bringing authors together with readers, we create a space for engaging conversations, for exciting conversations, and we make the literary world accessible to the Philadelphia community. There's still much more to come in our spring season. From now through early June, we'll welcome to this stage poets, novelists, physicians, political commentators, a United States senator, and much more. And I do hope that you'll join us. You can register for these events on our webpage. That's freelibraryfoundation.org. I also want to say just a few quick words about our organization in general. The Foundation works together with the Free Library to support programming and advance its mission of promoting literacy throughout the Philadelphia region. As a nonprofit, we are reliant upon your support to help us achieve these goals, so please do consider donating, which you can also do through our website. Again, that's freelibraryfoundation.org. Before we get to tonight's program, there are a few people and organizations I would like to thank. We are grateful first and foremost to this season's sponsor, Comcast, whose support allows us to keep these events as accessible and as affordable as possible. I would also like to thank Uncle Bobby's, our partner bookseller, whom you may have seen up in the lobby, and the Philadelphia Citizen, our new media partner. Tonight, we welcome Jaap de Roode, who is Samuel Candler Dobbs Professor of Biology at Emory University, where he is director of the Infectious Diseases Across Scales training program, which trains graduate students in interdisciplinary science to study and control infectious disease. Tonight, he will be speaking with us about his fascinating new book, Doctors by Nature, which explores the healing power of nature through groundbreaking research and rigorous scientific insight. I know that you are all as excited for this talk as I am. Please join me in welcoming Jaap de Roode.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks so much for being here. It's really wonderful to be here at this beautiful building in this fantastic city. It's actually my first time to Philly, and I went to, yeah. Well, this is how I felt all day. It's a very welcoming city, and I checked out the Liberty Bell. I was talking to my kids about this yesterday. I said, what should I do in Philadelphia? Do you know about the Liberty Bell? And they said, isn't that cracked? So I'll go home and be able to tell them a lot more to the story than that. So what I want to talk about is really how I got into this whole topic of how animals can be doctors and how they can discover and use medicine and what we can learn from them. And it really goes back to my own research on monarch butterflies. Now, a lot of people are familiar with monarch butterflies. They're a really fascinating, famous, iconic butterfly here in North America, and they're famous for their migration they undertake every year in the fall from Canada and the United States all the way to Mexico, where they come together in the millions to overwinter. And when you go there, this is a shot I took in 2006, you can see some trees, but you can't really see the trees because they're covered in butterflies. It's really layers upon layers, and it's really one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. And this is why monarch butterflies are very, very popular and very famous. And people like dressing up like monarch butterflies. And there's a picture I've taken at a monarch butterfly festival in St. Mark's, Florida, where we go every year with my lab to talk to people about the science we do to study monarch butterflies. So this migration is really what makes monarchs very famous. But I always like to tell people that is not why I study monarchs, although we study migration right now. What brought me to monarch butterflies back in 2005 when I moved to the United States to study them is that they become sick. And this sounds very strange to a lot of people. You have to bear with me throughout this talk. I really like parasites, and not in my own body, but I like them as a biologist. I like studying them, and I think they have fascinating life cycles and fascinating challenges in their lives. And so monarch butterflies get this parasite called Ophreucystis electroscira. Most people call it OE for obvious reasons. And it's, when I first looked at this under the microscope, to me it looked like deflated footballs. I would call them American footballs, being from the Netherlands. But they're very nice and they're very big. And so a monarch butterfly can actually carry millions of these parasite spores on its body. And so this was a disease I was really interested in studying. Now, when the monarchs get really sick with this parasite, this is what ends up happening. And if you've seen pictures of monarch butterflies, either in National Geographic or in some random advertising campaign, because monarchs get used for anything. I even went to rent a bike in the Netherlands one day, and there was no monarchs in the Netherlands at all. And you should be able to rent a bike in the Netherlands without any advertising, but there was a picture of a monarch butterfly. But not one of this, because this is a very sick monarch butterfly. We usually see the healthy monarchs. This monarch is so infected with that parasite I just showed that it's stuck to the chrysalis, it cannot come out, and in this case we have a paper wasp who is actually taking advantage of the whole situation, cutting up that butterfly and taking the bits of monarch to her nest where she's going to feed her sisters with it. So that is what got me interested in monarchs in the first place. And what is really nice about the system when you study disease is that you can test for this parasite really easily. So we can put a sticker on the abdomen of the butterfly, pull it off, put it on an index card, and look under a very low magnification microscope to see if the monarch was infected. And so we can actually see if monarchs are sick without having to kill them or take really nasty blood samples or anything like that. We can just put a little sticker. And so I always compare it to the nose swabs for COVID. This is actually nicer for the monarch than sticking that thing up our nose. So it's a really great way to study. And so we can use that and actually find that migration gets rid of parasites because most of the monarchs that are sick don't make it all the way. So every year there's fewer parasites to start with. Now, one of the really fascinating things is that monarch butterflies are specialist feeders of milkweed. So when we talk about creating habitat for monarchs, it's always about planting milkweed. And so we have the little caterpillars, and what happens is those caterpillars eat up the spores that come from the mothers. So the mothers, when they lay eggs, some of these parasites end up the milkweeds, the caterpillars eat them up, and then the parasites reproduce inside the caterpillars, inside the pupa, and then when the butterfly ecloses from that pupal case, she or he is covered again in millions of these parasites. But because they're these specialist feeders on milkweeds, one of the things that I started wondering back in 2006 was how these different milkweeds could actually affect this parasite. Because we knew some of the milkweeds are very toxic, some are not. When we eat these plants, we may actually die. Monarchs don't because they're resistant to them. And we knew that they can use the chemicals in these milkweeds to protect themselves against predators. But my question was, can they also protect themselves against parasites? And so when we did experiments where we reared monarchs on non-toxic milkweed and toxic milkweed, we found that when they were reared on this toxic milkweed, those chemicals actually acted as medicine and the monarchs didn't become as sick. So then the logical question for me was to ask, can the monarchs actually take advantage of that? Can they actively use the medicinal plants when they need them? And so we did two types of experiments, one with caterpillars. And just for your reference, here is the first instar caterpillar, just after it's born. At the top is the fifth instar. That happens in about 12 days in our lab, very, very fast. They multiply their weight 3,000 times. And I calculated once what I would have to become in 12 days. Any guesses? Whale. Which one? Blue. The blue whale. I needed 2. Yeah, the biggest animal that's ever roamed the planet, and I needed 2. So they eat a lot. So we did experiments with the caterpillars, gave them choices between the toxic and the non-toxic milkweed. It turned out they made no choices at all. But that kind of makes sense when you think about who gets to choose, and it's really the mothers that decide what their babies are going to eat. It's the female butterflies that lay eggs on plants that then will be the food for the caterpillars. They're just born on their food, and that is what they will eat. So in the second round of experiments, we looked at adult butterflies. And what we had butterflies, they were all females, they had mated, and they were either infected with the parasite or not. And then we put them in these cages, we gave them a medicinal plant, a non-medicinal plant, and then simply counted the number of eggs that they laid on those plants. And what we found is that they have a very strong preference for the medicinal plant when they are sick. And so what happens in the system is that you have these female butterflies that have the parasites. When they lay eggs, they transmit some of these parasites to the eggs in the milkweeds. They cannot avoid that, but what they can do is give their caterpillars a better chance at resisting this parasite by giving them medicine that helps them prevent the infection, or if they do become infected, to reduce the symptoms of this disease. So to me, that was a very exciting finding, and it certainly is something that not a lot of people are aware of that animals can do. And so I love this quote from William Osler, where he says, "The desire to take medicine is one feature which distinguishes man, the animal, from his fellow creatures." And he gave an address to McGill University, I think it was early 1900s. And so this was really the sentiment at the time. William Osler was one of the founders of Johns Hopkins University. He was also the doctor who came up with the whole residency program, the idea that doctors can learn as much from being next to the patient at the bedside as from in a room like this. So he did a lot of things right, but this sentiment just doesn't make sense, right? And this is one of those things where humans like to be unique, and so we're always looking for ways that we're different from animals. And every time we come up with something, we do more studies and find out it's just not true, right? So animals have language, they make tools, they have culture, they have empathy. And the more we study, the more we find that animals can do some amazing things. So when we talk about medicine and animals using medicine, it's a behavior, right? It's animals making different choices to eat different things or to do different things when they are sick versus when they're not sick. And so the key question is to figure out who is actually benefiting from this behavior. And I love this picture for many different reasons. I already told you I love parasites. And so this is a female fly here at the bottom. She's infected with a fungus, and you can see all this white stuff. That's basically the mold growing on her body. That female is dead, but because of the fungal infections, her wings spread out in an inviting to a male position to say, "I'm ready for you." The fungus also makes pheromones that are really irresistible to the males. So this male is mating with a dead female, getting infected, and that is how the parasite manipulates these hosts, right? So you can look at a changed behavior. That doesn't mean the animal is medicating. Sometimes it's the parasite actually manipulating the host. So that is what we need to be very careful with if we study animals to find out, are they using medicine? We need to make sure they're actually benefiting from the behavior and not helping the parasite. Other great story is lemurs and capuchin monkeys, and what they love to do is have these millipedes. Millipedes actually create poisons to protect themselves against being eaten. And so they start oozing these liquids when you disturb them. So these lemurs will grab these millipedes and start biting them and tearing them in half and getting all these liquids, start rubbing it in their own fur, and then start rubbing it on each other. And these animals love it, and they go crazy over it. And these chemicals actually help them against mosquitoes and botflies, but we don't know if that's why they're doing it or whether that's really a beneficial side effect of them just having a good time, right? And having a good time, cementing their social relationship, much like some of us like to go to the pub and drink to socialize, right? Maybe that fends off parasites, maybe not, right? So that's the question. So that's what we're really trying to figure out. When you look at an animal, it's doing something, is it really using medicine? And then we have to go back to chimpanzees, because chimpanzees are really the first species in which scientists really demonstrated that animals use medicine. And for this story, you have to go back to the 1980s, and we have to go back to an American scientist who was born in Denver, but did all his training in primatology in Japan. And he worked together with a traditional healer who was also park ranger at Tanzania National Parks, and they were studying chimpanzees in Tanzania. And what they were doing, they were actually studying how chimpanzee societies work, and they were figuring out what is the role of the elderly chimpanzees in the societies. How are they helping the groups? What are they doing? And one day they were following a group of chimpanzees, and one of the chimpanzees named Chausiku was behaving differently. She was slow, she was lethargic, she had dark urine, she started making a nest in the middle of the day when they normally don't do that. She lay on her side on her log to defecate, they normally don't do that. And Hoffman started thinking, maybe she isn't right, maybe she's sick. And then what they saw her do, she went to a plant, a shrub, and it's called Vernonia, and she took a branch off, ripped the bark of the branch, and it started eating the inner pith and sucking out all of the bitter juices. And at that point, Mohammadi, who was the traditional healer, told Hoffman, the scientist, this is a plant we use for traditional medicine for all sorts of things, infections, fever, you name it. And we call it bitter leaf. And so then Mike Hoffman thought, maybe this chimpanzee is using this as medication. So super excited, they go back to the base camp. No one believes them because chimpanzees don't get sick. They certainly don't use medicine. That was really the scientific consensus. But he wasn't convinced. He thought, well, she's using a medicinal plant that she normally doesn't use. She's clearly sick, so let's go the next day. And the next day they found her again, and they saw her recover. And then she got all her energy back. She got her infant that she had left with other members of the group. She got him back and then ran off, and the researchers hardly could keep up with her, right? And then Mohammadi tells him, yeah, you know, when we use it in traditional medicine, it takes about 24 hours for individuals to recover. So I think the story is really interesting in that we have a primatologist in Japan, and this is important because the primatology in Japan at the time was very different from primatology in Europe and the Americas, because in Japan they didn't have this dualism underlying the culture where humans have to be unique and different from animals, whereas in Western science, everything where you think, oh, they're like humans, that was a no-no, you cannot go there. So American, European scientists would give their chimpanzees numbers, and in Japan they would give them names. So just having that idea, this is an individual with a personality that could do some interesting things was important. And then working with a traditional healer really helped him think, this may be medicine. And then they did all sorts of other studies. They found that the plants have chemicals that kill worms. They found that chimpanzees often have intestinal worms that make them very sick. They find that more chimpanzees use this plant in the rainy season when there are more parasites. And then they found that the dose that they use by sucking this pith is exactly the dose that traditional healers use in Tanzania. So that was really the first evidence scientifically that animals use medicine. But it wasn't the only, and it certainly wasn't the last. And I love the story about birds. This is actually the cover of the Dutch translation of the book, and I like to show that because it shows starlings that collect all sorts of plants and put them in their nests. And so the leading hypothesis at the same time as the chimpanzee studies was that they used this to ward off ectoparasites that suck the blood of the chicks. Now on the right you may wonder, why on earth am I showing such an ugly picture? It's a sidewalk in Mexico City, and if you look carefully there's a few cigarette butts there. And it turns out that animals, that birds, can use these cigarette butts as medicine. And so for this we have to go to a researcher, actually started as an undergraduate researcher in Mexico City, Monse Suarez Rodriguez. And she was really interested in finding out how do birds cope with the urban environments and all the pollution and all the trash that we put in the environment. And her idea was that having plastic and all sorts of other stuff is really gonna make the chicks suffer. Maybe they get tangled, maybe they get sick because of chemicals. And so she was working, looking at the nests of house finches and house sparrows that make their nests on this library at the university, the UNAM, University of Mexico City. And then she found all this white fluffy material in a lot of the nests, and she couldn't figure out what it was. And it wasn't until it rained that she smelled smoke. And then she realized these are the filters of the cigarette butts that people discard. People at the library, when they're reading books all day, they take a step outside to get some fresh air and then smoke, yeah? And then they discard the cigarette butts. And it's really easy for the birds to collect that. You can see a picture there on the right of the bird with a cigarette butt in its beak. So then she went to her advisor, and like so many advisors, they don't believe their students, right, at first. And so she had to make the nest wet and say, look, it smells like smoke. These are cigarette butts. And they said, oh, yeah, that makes sense. And then what they found is that when the birds had more cigarette butts in the nest, some of them had 34 cigarette butts, a lot of cigarette butts, that when they had more, they had fewer parasites, so fewer mites and fewer lice, fewer things that suck the blood of the chicks. But then the beautiful thing about this story is that can still be a side effect, right? Maybe the birds use it as building material, and as a beneficial side effect, it also kills parasites. So then she did this ingenious experiment where she was basically taking the nests, removing the lining that the birds make, and made her own lining. This took 2 years because birds don't like it when you mess with their nests. You can imagine that. But then when she figured that out, she replaced the linings, and then she either added live ticks, ticks suck blood, or she added ticks that she had killed that can no longer suck the blood of the chicks, or she added nothing. And then what she found is that the birds started collecting more cigarette butts when they had the live ticks. And she also found that the birds do better, so the chicks survive better, they're better fledglings, but it's also not without a cost. And so here she is showing that lining. That's me looking very excited about a cigarette butt. The most exciting I've ever been about a cigarette. But one of the key things about medicine, and we all know this when we use medicine and we read that leaflet that comes with it, or we decide not to read it because if we read it, we think, ooh, this thing is going to kill me, right? I've got a little bump on my toe, but this thing is going to kill me, right? Side effects are very important. That's really what defines medicine. And we see that with the cigarette butts. They cause some problems, malformations of blood cells in the birds, that Vernonia, that bitter leaf in chimpanzees, if they eat too much of it, it kills them, right? So that's really a hallmark of medicine that animals have to deal with as well. So there's so many different examples. So we started with chimpanzees, and people at the time said animals cannot use medicine, they're not smart enough, they're not humans. Then people show chimpanzees can do it. It's like, okay, they're very much like us, I can accept that. Maybe birds, they're still vertebrates, but now we know insects can do it too. And there's actually so many examples now of insects that use really fascinating ways to medicate themselves and their nests and their relatives. And one of them, this is David Attenborough, one of my heroes in life. We should celebrate him especially much during Earth Day today. He has done so much for our understanding of the Earth. And here he is in the Jura Mountains in Switzerland at a very big ant nest. And these are wood ants. And one of the things that these ants do, they put resin in their nest. Here we have 2 ants with a bit of resin. Resin is the sticky stuff that trees produce, and they produce it to heal wounds, protect themselves against insects or bacterial or fungal infections. But what the ants do, they start collecting it from conifer trees and loading their nests with it. And what this does, it reduces infections with bacteria and viruses and fungi, and they especially like to put it around where the baby ants are. And they do it more when there is baby ants. And this is a preventative form of medicine where they just put a lot of medicinal stuff that keeps those baby ants healthy. And bees do the same. So bees also collect resin. Here we have a worker bee with 2 bits of resin stuck to her legs where she normally collects the pollen. And this stuff is really sticky, so when she comes back to the nest, she cannot remove it. There are other ants or other bees that have assist her to get it off. And then what they do, they mix it with the wax that they make, and they make it into a substance called propolis. Now, propolis is a substance that humans have used for thousands of years as a medicinal substance. If you go to South America, to any corner shop or any market, you can buy it as a cure for anything, essentially. Antimicrobial, antifungal, antiviral. But somehow people never thought that bees use it for the same reason. Now, we have a bee crisis, and this has been going on for decades now. And this is a really interesting campaign that Whole Foods did together with the Cersei Society for the Protection of Invertebrates. And what they did is go to a Whole Foods and just take all the produce away that we would lose if we didn't have bees. Right? And you see a massive difference. It's estimated that bees are responsible for about 1/3 of the food we eat. But at the same time, bees aren't doing well. And so here we have another beautiful parasite, if you like parasites. So imagine something that resembles a tick, but is the size of a donut and sits on your stomach, eating out your liver. Okay? And then sometimes have 3 or more of them on you. So that's just one of the threats to honeybees that we have. And these mites don't just eat up the liver, they also transmit all sorts of viruses, some that really disrupt the wings. It's called deformed wing virus, the bees cannot fly. And so we have a lot of these problems. And why is that? Well, part of the reason is that when we look at our beekeeping practices, I told you that bees like to collect this resin, make it into propolis, and bees that live in hollow trees that have really rough surfaces, they smoothen it out with this stuff, make this beautiful envelope, and that protects them against viruses, bacteria, fungi, mites, other things, so many different things. But when we put bees in these bee boxes that are 6 planks, smooth planks, the only place where the bees can still put the propolis is in the corners, and they cement the lid shut. Now, beekeepers don't like this. If you go to a Beekeeper 101 course, the first thing they tell you is how to remove it. And so unwittingly, we have removed this medicine from the bees and caused all these problems. And so now the USDA and other scientists are actually working on creating new boxes that are rough, that have grooves. The bees fill them up, they stay healthier, make more honey, and make more babies. And so it's a really easy way to bring back that medicine to our bees. And we can do the same with livestock. This is Juan Villalba at Utah State University. And he and Fred Provenza, a colleague of his, have done decades worth of experiments with sheep and goats and cattle and found that these animals are really good, not just assembling their own diet, but choosing the medicinal plants when they need them. And then avoiding them when they don't need them, because again, the medicinal plants in these animals have those negative side effects as well. The problem is when we give these animals just one type of food and we give them this mixed ration that has all the nutrients they need, according to us, but they don't have any of the medicinal substances, we have to add antibiotics and anti-worm medicine, and it causes all sorts of problems, including resistance. What they have shown is when you let animals choose their own diet, they choose the medicinal plants when they need them, but they also eat less overall. So you can cut the costs of production by 20% and cut the greenhouse emissions by 20% as well. And so one way is to have these mixed paddocks, but you can also just give them the different components of their food, even in high-intensity livestock industry. So they're really pushing for that idea, bring this medicine back to our animals. They will be healthier, they will be happier, and we will actually pay less and pollute less to produce the same amount of milk, the same amount of meat. All right, so big question, how do animals know what they're doing? And you know, a lot of the resistance against animals using medicine is the idea that they're not smart enough. And that comes from the idea that we think, some of us think, that humans always know exactly what they're doing, which is not true. But there's a good story to figure out that animals don't need to know at all. And so one of the stories is the woolly bear caterpillar. Some people would call these fuzzy wuzzy caterpillars. My kids call them fuzzy wuzzies. And they get another beautiful, horrendous parasite. This is actually a monarch caterpillar, a picture I took myself, but they get these parasitoid flies. And what parasitoid flies do, they lay their eggs on the caterpillar, then the maggot comes out of the egg, eats its way inside. The caterpillar eats it up from the inside out, leaves all the crucial organs intact until they're ready to come out, and then they eat their way out and kill the caterpillar in its wake. Pretty much like the Alien movie, the original one. So these woolly bear caterpillars get them too. In effect, circled here is an egg on the caterpillar. And it turns out when these caterpillars eat particular alkaloids, specific toxic chemicals, it is bad for the flies. It can kill the flies with it. And what's really interesting is that these caterpillars have 4 different taste receptors, and one of them specifically tastes these alkaloids. Now, when the caterpillars are infected, and they have done wonderful experiments putting tiny electrodes in the taste buds of these caterpillars, they can show that when they're infected, the nerve cells that attach to those taste receptors start firing at a higher rate, which means these alkaloids just start tasting so good when they're infected. And because they taste good, they eat more of it. Imagine you're sick and chocolate tastes good, you eat more chocolate. That's really the idea. So the caterpillars don't need to know what they're doing. They don't need to learn. It's their bodies telling them, this tastes good. Keep on eating it, and it helps them. Now, that's not to say that there aren't other ways. But I think that these built-in mechanisms for medication are very common. And for a long time, people didn't think that any behaviors are genetic, right? Some of you may be aware of the nature and nurture debate. You know, are our behaviors due to our genes or our environment? It's both. But some of the first evidence that genes are important for behavior comes from hygienic behavior in bees. Here we see bees removing a larva from one of the brood cells in the hive. And they often do this when the larvae are infected, and they do it to prevent the spread of disease to other individuals in the colony. So they open the cell because there's wax on top, they remove the wax, pull out the larva, and dump it outside the hive. Seems sad, but it helps the other bees, right? And it turns out that there is one gene that allows the bees to uncap the cell and a second gene that allows them to throw out that larva. Ingenious experiments have shown that. So this was one of the first experiments to show that, yes, behaviors can be genetic, and that means these animals don't need to know what they're doing at all. Now, learning can be very important. In fact, associative learning is really important for the goats and the sheep and the cattle when they are sick with parasites, say worms in their guts, and they eat plants that have a lot of tannins. Their symptoms get reduced, and now they make that association. Next time they're sick, they're going for those plants that have those tannins. And then there is social learning as well that we know of, for example, in sheep. So lambs are much better at developing their self-medication behaviors when the mothers are around. So separating lambs from the mothers is not good for a lot of reasons, including the fact that they don't learn the medicine as well. And chimpanzees and other apes are really good at copying each other too. And so one other form of medication that chimpanzees use is they often use leaves, not like this is well, it's fake, but it's also very smooth. But a lot of leaves are very rough. And so what chimpanzees will often do is they take the leaf, fold it over, put it in the mouth and swallow it. And the bristles work like Velcro. So when they go through the gut, they make parasites stick to them, they irritate the gut, the chimpanzees have diarrhea, and the parasites are out. But the way to fold that, you can imagine there's many different ways. If you have a long leaf, you're going to fold it like this first or crumple it up. And so different groups of chimpanzees do different things. And it means that one individual comes up with a method and everyone else follows suit and copies that behavior. Great example of culture and medicine all at the same time. All right, any dog lovers in the room? Yeah? Okay. You were saying, when is he going to talk about dogs? So dogs like to eat grass, as a lot of us know. This is my own dog. His name is Tucky. This is actually a picture taken by my son with his iPhone in the park in front of our house. And I remember when for the book, I needed permissions for the pictures to get them published. And so I prepared this form for him. His name is Jaap. And I said, Jaap, can you sign this? And he gets the form and he looks at me. I said, no, I'm not going to pay you. You know, it's an honor to be in this book. So, youth these days, you know. Turns out the literature, there is so little known about why domesticated dogs eat grass. So there's only a handful of studies. And so what are the leading hypotheses? Well, some people say it's for nutrition. Others say it's they eat it and then they throw up. A lot of us will have seen that, yeah? Others will say they eat it and then they have diarrhea and something comes out. So very little evidence or little studies done on domestic dogs. Also very little on domestic cats. Here's a cat eating grass. And here's a really recent study. So we actually know from wild carnivores, so carnivores are animals that we associate with eating meat, right? But it turns out all those carnivores, whether it's tigers or jaguars, coyotes, wolves, mountain lions, they eat grass. And often they eat grass that even goats do not want to eat. And the myth is that goats eat everything, right? But they often eat grass. And this is a study that came out a few months ago from a paper, and I love it. There's a jaguar in South America eating grass, really rough grass. There were a lot of pictures in between. I went from A to G to spare you the pictures of the cat throwing up. But in picture G, you can see that the throw up has a worm in it. And so this is what people find often when they look at all these different carnivores. You find these bits of throw up with worms. You find diarrhea with worms. And in fact, right after I read this paper, the next day we were walking my dogs, and I was with my daughter, and there was this beautiful piece of throw up on the path in the park, and I think it was a coyote, and of course it's like, I was checking it out. I didn't see any worms. It's, you know, it's different when your dad loves parasites. But so the story that's developing is that our dogs and our cats do this because they get it from their ancestors when their ancestors were still wild. They were using this behavior to get rid of parasites, and that's the most likely reason our dogs do this. And in fact, 2 weeks ago, one of my dogs, I found him he was carrying a rubber band with the number pi, but it didn't have all the decimals. Well, you can't actually make an arm, but I think it should have had like 25 decimals. There were only 10, and I said, Jaap, is this yours? He said, oh yeah, it's mine. It's like, okay, you shouldn't leave stuff on the floor. And I kept on wondering, where's the other bit? And then we went for a walk, my dog ate grass, and then 8 hours later he threw up, and there was the rest, right? So it's not just parasites, it's rubber bands, it's Barbie doll heads, it's Lego pieces, all of those things that they use. All right, cat lovers in the room? Yes? Familiar with the catnip response? So a lot of our cats love catnip. So you can buy catnip, plant catnip. You can also buy all sorts of tools that are impregnated with catnip chemicals. But why do they do it? Clearly they love it because they go completely delirious and crazy when they roll over this stuff. But why are they doing it? That's a really good question. People have known about catnip responses for a long time. So there's Neolithic evidence from 4,000 years ago that showed that settlements had places where they grew catnip. This is a beautiful picture from 1859 by a Japanese scientist who talk about silvervine, which is another plant that elicits this response. And this is the battle between cats and mice. And the mice are very clever because they know the cats go crazy and they intoxicate them with the silvervine so they can win the battle. Now, it's very nice that this is a Japanese picture because it was only in the last few years that Japanese scientists have actually finally found out why cats do this. And so I'm going to show you a few videos here by these researchers, Reiko and Masao. And again, this research was started by an undergraduate student. And I love this because young people have these open minds to study things. But here what they did, they had silvervine, they extracted the chemicals, and then put different fractions on different filter papers in this cage, and then let the cat smell it and see what it's going to do. And then it's testing them all, and then it's making up its mind, and there it goes. It loves it. And so it turns out there's one specific chemical in this silvervine. There's no plant there, but the chemical is there, and the cat goes crazy. All right, so now they did a really fantastic experiment where they blocked specific opioid receptors. So you may be familiar with endorphins, those basically opioids that our own bodies produce. And so this system is involved in this pleasure response in the cats. So this is the same cat on day 1 when they gave the cat saline. On day 2, they gave the same cat naloxone, which is a chemical that blocks those receptors for this opioid. So the cat on day 2 shouldn't feel any pleasure. I know that's sad, but we have the chemical in one dish, the control in the other, and so they're tasting it, they're licking it, they do that to figure out if it's there. And on day 1, it keeps on licking it. You see, on day 2, it's getting bored. It's not impressed. It wants to get out. Even on day 1, it went crazy, right? So it's the pleasure system that evokes the response, but that's, not why it is doing it. And so one more video here, and this was to show why are they actually rolling around? Are they rolling around just for fun, or are they rolling around to coat themselves in the chemicals? So here what the researchers do is they put a petri dish on the top of the cage, and there goes the cat. And now if it's still rolling around, you'd say, well, the chemical elicits its response, they love it. But if it doesn't do that and it starts rubbing at the top, then it really seems like what they're doing is coating themselves with this chemical. And there it goes. So it's rubbing, coating itself in that chemical, and not rolling around. And by doing that, what they're doing is they're actually protecting themselves against mosquitoes. And so what the research did next, they had the cats with and without the chemicals, put them on either side of a cage, released mosquitoes, and found the cats with the chemical didn't get as many bites. Then they felt bad for the cats, so then they smeared the chemical on their own arms and went on either side of the cage, and it worked for humans too. So they have now patented this chemical to actually develop into a human repellent against mosquitoes. So just in the last few years, we have seen an example of cats discovering a chemical we can use ourselves, but this is not really new. And so one of the biggest surprises for me in writing the book is that people have looked at animals for thousands of years. So the first scientific evidence from the 1980s, but people have looked at animals for a long time to discover medicine. In a lot of cultures, humans dress up like other animals. They want to become other animals. And this is as part of their shamanistic rituals. For example, in North America, Native Americans become bears and learn from bears, and they develop medicines based on bears. Even the medicine aspirin, which a lot of you may have used, was originally discovered by bears. When they come out of their hibernation, they go for the bark of willow trees, they eat it, and it reduces a lot of the symptoms or the pain, the inflammation they have from lying still for so long. People started using it. Eventually, we made it into aspirin. And that's not the only one. So we can look at traditional healers, both in Asia and Africa. People have looked at elephants, come up with all sorts of treatments, including treating stomach upset. Some people in Asia even use extractions from the dung of the elephants to cure all sorts of things based on the medicinal plants that the animals are using. And then there are goats. I've mentioned goats a few times, but the legend is, so at Emory University, where I do my work, we have a coffee bar called Dancing Goats. We also have a coffee bar called Caldi. Now, legend goes that Caldi was a goat herder, and that he was herding his goats when they started eating the berries of a coffee bush, and they become all active and frisky. And he told a monk at a nearby monastery about it, and he brewed it into a drink that we now call coffee, and that is probably keeping some of us awake tonight. Horny goatweed. I think you can guess where this is going, so I will leave it at that. But that brings me to Earth Day, right? And so what I think is really intriguing about all of this is that animals can use medicine. They have a lot of knowledge that we may not have realized or appreciated for a long time. But at the same time, we're, of course, destroying nature at a very high rate, a rapid rate, getting rid not just of the medicines, but also the medical doctors, right? And right now we're in a mass extinction that is caused by humans. So I think it's especially important on a day like this, Earth Day, to recognize that by realizing how important nature is, not just for the animals in living it, but also the potential discovery that can help ourselves, we have yet another reason to try to save that. So as part of my own work, I work together with the Rosalind Carter Butterfly Trail that was started by the late former First Lady, Rosalind Carter. And what we do is we really try to get people to recreate native habitats. My lab provides a lot of milkweeds as well as other native plants that people can plant. And this is just one example of how I transformed my own front yard. When I moved in, it was all grass that needs pesticides, fertilization, lots of water, doesn't support anything, to this beautiful ecosystem of native plants with bees and caterpillars and everything like that. And so one of the things I hope that book does is just make people realize how amazing nature is, how amazing animals are, but maybe even for the few people that don't appreciate it for the sake of nature, that they may say, well, I could actually get rich by studying animals and producing medicines and discover something new. And this is my dogs just demonstrating. This is actually funny because this was done for a photo shoot when Emory University wrote an article on my book. We went to a little river, my dogs came along, and while we were setting up the lighting, they were demonstrating that all I have said is actually true. Thank you so much. All right, we have time for questions.
Great talk.
Thank you.
Isn't it true, however, that while the animals used the medicinal properties of whatever plants were in their area, it was more of a trial and error, so almost a Darwinian effort to succeed, and those that found it succeeded, and those that didn't pass their genes on. So it's not quite a disproof of Osler's statement, but more a proof of Darwin.
Yes, I agree. I think that, and I think that's the important thing, thinking about this in the terms of natural selection, that our behaviors that allow animals to use this medicine, therefore they survive, they leave their offspring that carry the traits that made them do so, I think is a really powerful way of developing this. But I will also say that that is true for humans as well, right? And so we can think now of, the way we study medicine, we can be very conscious about it, and really thinking about these are diseases we have now, we're going to try all these things in these particular ways. But certainly how people evolved early on and used that traditional medicine, a lot of that was trial and error as well. Yeah.
I just bought a bunch of tropical milkweed seeds, thinking that I better plant them instead of the swamp milkweed. Would you recommend that?
No, sorry.
No.
No. It's a really interesting thing. So tropical milkweed is not native to most of the United States. So it's really been in southern Florida for a long time, but in other places it's not. And so it can have individual benefits, but for the population, it's actually not good. And the reason for that is that tropical milkweed, despite its name, is cold hardier than the native milkweeds we have here. And that means when the other milkweeds, the native ones, die, a lot of the tropical milkweed will keep on growing. And in some places, especially along along the Gulf Coast, you have tropical milkweed keeping on growing throughout the winter. Monarchs keep on breeding, keep on spreading parasites. In some of those places, 100% of the monarchs are now infected. And we have seen parasite prevalence go up from about 1% 20 years ago to 10% now. And we think it's partly because of these breeding opportunities that we are creating. So as part of my recommendations in the Rosalind Carter Butterfly Trail, we say native milkweeds, even though it seems tempting to help individual monarchs, it's actually going to make most of them worse off in the end.
What would you say would be the worst invasive species epidemic of this age?
Humans. Yeah. Wow. Other than humans, I think, as a parasitologist, I would probably have to maybe say SARS-CoV-2. There's, of course, so many species that have spread in lots of different ways, but a lot of species do a lot of local damage. So I think it's going to depend on where you are. I think it's hard to pinpoint which one is the worst. Sorry if that's not a very good answer.
Can I take it? I would ask this question in Dutch because I'm Dutch like you, but I want to be inclusive, so I'll ask it in English. You obviously love animals. Are you vegan?
I am not vegan. I love animals, but I also, as a biologist, I also see our biology is that of an omnivore, and I believe that if we treat our animals well and increase their welfare, I think there is a place for eating meat. I certainly eat a lot less than I used to, but I'm not vegan. Yeah.
Do you eat grass?
I do not eat grass, no. I tend to use, and so I think it's a great question, actually, because, some people take the things I say in the book as, let's get rid of modern medicine and just go back to what animals do. But that's not necessary. We have really good medicines, but a lot of them are based on what we learn from animals. But just going back to eating grass, no, I'm not doing that. But also, I don't have worms because of the environment I live in. So I don't really need grass, and I don't eat my son's rubber bands. So.
I wonder if you could say a little bit more, though, following up on the question about are you a vegan, about your opinion about, on this Earth Day, the impact that a plant-based or vegan diet could have on the environment.
So I think when I teach introductory biology at Emory University, we talk about it when we cover climate change. And so there's a lot of ways that you can, improve the health of animals, but also reduce the impact of the environment. And one of the things I always show my students is that actually when you eat beef, that's the worst thing that you can eat because it's the least efficient way of turning plant biomass into meat. It also releases most of the greenhouse gases. So but I always suggest, but I tell the students what I do, and I'm not telling them they should do it. What I do is I have severely reduced my intake of meat. And when I do eat meat, I try to eat things such as chicken and pork that have a much lower impact on the environment. It's interesting because there's also studies, some of the meat alternatives, they're not actually based on the current production. The reductions are not as good as we may want. So for me, it's like a varied diet, reducing meat and choosing the ones that have the least impact on the environment, personally.
It was interesting how you talked a lot about the difference in the kind of cultural mindset between Western science and Eastern science. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if you think that maybe more scientists in the West will kind of adopt your mindset, being more open to natural influence, or do you think you're kind of more on the fringe of that kind of thinking?
No, I think it's definitely becoming clearer and clearer. And I think that we just have needed a long time to realize. And, you know, but it is interesting how people are, in Western science still are, I would say, obsessed with seeing how unique we are. And just as an example, there was a whole series of papers last week in Nature or Science, I can't remember, one of the top journals in the field that sequenced the genomes of a lot of different apes, including orangutans, gorillas, and also some gibbons. And, you know, the title of it is finding out what makes us unique. And I think, why? Why is that important? 2 weeks ago, there was a study that showed that bonobos have language that is really like human language. So, you know, we have known that animals use all sorts of different types of language. What makes human language really not, well, unique, we thought, or some of us thought, is that the way we put words together changes the meaning. And so a really good example of that is when you talk about a cook, someone who cooks food, and tall. A tall cook is a cook that is tall. But a good cook is not necessarily a cook that's a good person. It's a cook that cooks well. And so bonobos have that same thing. So they have different calls, and this was just shown 2 weeks ago in a publication, that they have different calls. When they put them together, it completely changes the meaning. So it's yet another thing where, now we're looking for something else. So there's still a very big focus on seeing what makes us unique. And I often like to say that what makes us unique is the wish to be unique.
Thank you for speaking this evening. I was fascinated by how bees and the resin and these things that are just seemingly industrious in nature, how it comes about where something man-made artificial is almost counterintuitive relative to the resin and collecting it, and as a bee farmer might look to increase his yield by taking out these things that are going to protect the hive, as it were. Are there other type of, like, I would say, counter synergies or things that happen that are counter that we can incorporate into, if we're cultivating a more biodiverse type of urban farm, looking towards soil and things that are scalable on a small scale, like a agrarian perspective of just how engineering and applying these other sciences in addition to biology can help in terms of just more intuitive design of our incubators?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really great question. And I think just by realizing or appreciating that animals have all these abilities, what really animals need is they need to have choices. And so you see that with the bees, they need to have choices to use that resin. You know, goats and cattle, they need choices between different plants so they can find the medicinal plants they need. Our dogs and cats need choices too. And when I go to dog parks and I see a dog eat grass, the owners usually like jerk them away. They don't let them do it, right? So that's choices at a lower level. There's all sorts of other reasons why integrated agricultural systems are great, because we have known for a long time that monocultures are really bad for, getting decimated by disease. So having more diversity and, lower numbers of each different species, that, really reduces that aspect of disease as well.
Hey, thanks for the fascinating talk. I'm really interested by your, interest in the parasites. So just had a curious question. So in your presentation, you had examples of animals utilizing medicine to, get rid of parasites. So let's take a next step further. In your experience, have you noticed, to your knowledge, are there parasites that have further changed the behaviors of such animals so that they become resistant to that kind of medicines? Because, there's like antimicrobial resistant bacteria, for example. Are there such parasites that have evolved so that they further go past these animal, doctors?
It's a really great question, and not yet, but so there's a few things to it. So yes, there is definitely a possibility that parasites evolve resistance to the medicine that animals are using, and this is really how the arms races between hosts and parasites have gone. And so, we have evolved our whole complicated immune system, but parasites keep on finding ways to, outrun our immune system, so we have to keep on evolving. And so that's probably true for this as well. I think The problem right now is this is such a young field that, and to demonstrate that an animal uses medicine, we have very strict criteria. So one of the criteria is that it helps the animal. Whereas if the parasite is not affected, we wouldn't call it medicine, but it could be a case where it used to be medicine, but now the parasite doesn't get affected by it anymore. So I think we're going to find more examples like that. The other thing I think is important is that when we see the antibiotic resistance and resistance to anthelmintics that kill worms, it's often based on single chemicals. So when we apply medicines, our pharmaceutical industry really likes getting single chemicals that are completely pure, that you can put in one tablet, and that's all there is in it. Whereas you think about that resin that bees collect, it's got thousands of chemical compounds. It's really hard for parasites to evolve resistance to all those different compounds at the same time. And so that requires this shift in thinking when we want to apply those things in, stepping away from this single chemical solves all to accepting the fact that sometimes you need a whole batch of chemicals. And for some of them, you may not know what they're doing. And that's really difficult to persuade the pharmaceutical industry right now. So I kind of went from your question back to a question in the back. But yeah, the answer to your question is not yet.